Lesson 3.10, Graphs with Multiple Data Sets. Our objective for this lesson is to be able to create a multiple bar graph, a multiple line chart, or a stack plot to represent multiple sets of data at once. First, let's define multiple bar graph. So a multiple bar graph is a bar graph with two or more sets of bars that allow comparison of two or more data sets. So here we're going to have multiple data sets for each category of data. And so within each category, we'll have a rectangle for each of the data sets. And that allows us to compare the two data sets by looking at the relative heights of the sets of bars. So that's a multiple bar graph. Next, we have a multiple line chart. A multiple line chart is a line chart with two or more lines representing two or more sets of data. So to create a line chart, we would create that the same way that we would, or to create a multiple line chart, we would create that the same way that we would create a line chart with dots representing the values. And we would just do that for each set of data and connect the dots for each one. And so you're going to have multiple lines on the same graph. And we usually use different colors for the lines or different styles of lines, like a dotted line or a dashed line, so that you can easily see what the different lines represent and compare the data that way. Finally, we have a stacked plot or a stack plot. A stack plot is a graph that shows different data sets stacked upon one another. So we'll usually use this type of graph if we're interested in comparing the different sets of data, but we're also interested in all of the data combined and comparing them from, say, one time period to another. For example, let's say that we have a test that's given to freshmen and sophomores. And so we're interested in how well freshmen do compared to how well sophomores do, but we're also interested in tracking year after year how well everyone does total. So we might use a stack plot where we'll put the scores of the freshmen and then the scores of the sophomores on top of that, so that we can not only compare the relative scores of freshmen and sophomores, but we can compare how well both classes did year after year. Our example gives us these data and asks us to create a multiple bar graph, a multiple line chart, and a stack plot for these data. And before we begin to create those graphs, I first wanted to just look at the data and see if we can get an understanding of what's going on just from the numbers. So we can see that these are 4 serious diseases, and these are the death rates per 100,000 people from 1900 to 2010. And we can see that cancer started off with a death rate of 68. It was the lowest among these 4 diseases, and has risen since then. It got to a peak of 203 deaths per 100,000 in 1990, and it's come down slightly since then, but is still higher than the 1980 death rates. So cancer has been on the rise for most of this time period. Tuberculosis, on the other hand, was the second leading cause of death from among these diseases in 1900, with 185 deaths per 100,000. But those numbers came down dramatically for tuberculosis, to the point that since 1970, the death rate has been at 0 deaths per 100,000. Cardiovascular disease has been the #1 cause of death throughout this time period. It started at 360 deaths per 100,000 in 1900, reached a peak in 1950 of 510 deaths per 100,000, and has come down ever since. In fact, since 1980, it's come down dramatically. And then pneumonia. Pneumonia, like tuberculosis, started high and came down significantly from 1900 to about 1950. But unlike tuberculosis, it never got all the way down to zero. Since 1950, it's been in the 20s. So there's a kind of an understanding of what has happened with these four diseases over this time period from 1900 to 2010. So let's create our three graphs and see if that will, which one gives us our best visual understanding of what's happening. So let's highlight this data and let's go to insert, and we can see all of our different graphs available here. Let's start with our column here and do a 2D column. That's going to give us our multiple bar graph. And you can see the gray is cardiovascular disease, and that's been the #1 since here. We can see blue is cancer, and it's been on the rise for most of this time, reaching a peak in 1990 and coming down slightly since. And tuberculosis and pneumonia started relatively high and have come down significantly since. All right, so let's change this chart title here, and we'll call these death rate for there's our title, and there's our multiple bar graph. Now with this same information highlighted here, let's change this to a multiple line graph, and there's that multiple line graph. We'll just put that right over the top, and I won't bother changing the chart title again. But here you can see that instead of the data represented by these rectangles or these bars, it's represented by lines, and you can see the cardiovascular disease has remained on top and has reached a peak in about 1950 and has come down since. The cancer rates have been on the rise throughout this, and then tuberculosis and pneumonia started relatively high and have come down. So those that's the multiple bar graph. And then now let's look at the at our stack plot. So we're going to go to area graph, and we're going to choose this this middle one here, the stacked area. And there's our stack plot. And here the death rates for each individual disease is given by the width of these wedges here. So you can see that cancer started relatively low, has been on the rise. The cardiovascular disease is taking up the bulk of this stack throughout the whole thing. And you can see by the width, it's increased up to about 1950 and then has decreased ever since. And you can see these triangle shapes created by the tuberculosis wedge and the pneumonia wedge, indicating that they've come down significantly since 1900. And you can see that pneumonia has never really gone away. It's got this this little width here still of about 20 deaths per 100,000. So overall, what the stack plot allows us to see is that overall the death rates for these four diseases have been coming down consistently since 1900. even though some diseases have gone up, others have gone down. Altogether, they've all come down. So those are our three ways of representing multiple data sets with a single graph.